It's the Believe in Texans podcast brought to you by FanDuel. I am sitting in an office in front of the Galleria. That's the Galleria over that way, Wesleyan up that way if you're watching on YouTube. And I am eagerly anticipating the start of training camp. Got a little bit over a week. See another couple teams start before the Texans. But look, the story is and has been and will be about CJ Stroud. The Athletic wrote an article a couple days ago identifying the players on each NFL team that are under the most pressure. And I'll give you 3 seconds to think about, ponder it, and question, hey, who did the Athletic say for the Texans? Yeah, it's CJ Stroud. Okay, it's CJ Stroud. But it got me to thinking about a few of the other potential players that are either under pressure with the Texans, coaches, GMs, etc., as well as for some of their upcoming opponents. But look, yes, the Athletic named CJ Stroud. On FanDuel right now, CJ Stroud's over-under for passing yards is 3,550.5 passing yards. If he stays healthy this entire season and plays at his same level or better than he did last year, then he's going to get that many yards passing. And that's the big question, isn't it? Okay, what's he going to look like this year? I think it's going to look better for multiple reasons we'll get into. But one of the little blurbs in what they wrote about CJ said, well, Houston did pick up Stroud's fifth-year option this spring. The lack of playoff success has given the Texans pause in awarding the quarterback a long-term contract extension. Instead, they're taking a wait-and-see approach. That's interesting in the way they framed it. And they had also pointed out that they'd won playoff games previously. But it's not the overall lack of playoff success. I think if the Texans had lost to the Patriots, but CJ Stroud put in a good effort, things might look a little bit different. Might also look a little bit different if he'd had a more impressive and productive regular season. Lots of ifs. Okay, we're dealing with a lot of ifs here. But Robert Mays, who writes for The Athletic, was talking about CJ Stroud, and he made an interesting comparison. And it's one that we've talked about, but the Trevor Lawrence dynamic, where he got his extension after his third year a couple years ago.
How I feel about CJ Stroud right now is adjacent to how I felt about Trevor Lawrence a couple of years ago. You can see the vision for what he would be at his best. You can understand that if you put this guy in the right circumstances, he is good enough for you to have a really good offense. And the Jags did pay Trevor Lawrence $55 million a year. And when their offensive ecosystem got to a place that was really, really healthy, you saw what a quarterback like that could be and how good that offense could be. I kind of feel like CJ Stroud is existing in a similar space to the one that Trevor Lawrence has over the last couple seasons.
I think that's fair to say. And I think the big thing to remember with Trevor Lawrence was that it's like we've had two stretches of time in his career where he had a really good second half of a season. But by and large, most people, I think inside and outside of Jacksonville, are still waiting to see whether it was worth giving him that contract or not. And with Trevor Lawrence, that was right when people were really thinking, man, quarterback salaries keep going up. We got to pay this guy because if it works out, then he's going to be making so much more money. Interesting thing about that is that it's plateaued at $55 million, and we've talked about that a fair amount. I think it's fair to say that this is the year that the average quarterback contract for new deals is going to go up above $55 million by a pretty substantial margin. And like substantial, maybe $65 million or so. I'm still of the opinion that, man, the risk reward here is if you get through the regular season and the playoffs and you feel awesome about CJ Stroud, then oh no, we have to pay $10 million per year more for our quarterback that we're really, really certain about, versus paying a guy that amount of money and then waiting and seeing and wondering and second guessing and having a Tua Tagovailoa or a Kyler Murray type situation. I think it just makes the most sense right now that they wait until next year. That feels like where it's going. The trouble like that with that is that the Texans do a pretty good job of keeping these things under wrap until all of a sudden one day it's announced that, hey, by the way, Nico Collins got a contract. Derek Stingley got a contract. Will Anderson got a contract. I just don't anticipate it. So yes, CJ is under a lot of pressure to perform better than he did in the regular season last year. And that's multiple moving parts above and beyond just CJ, obviously. That's the offensive line. That's the wide receivers. That's the tight ends. And Marlon Klein, the draft pick, is a tight end. There are a lot of moving parts to it, but CJ is the conductor of this orchestra. Needs to have a better year, both in the regular season, if you really want to feel comfortable giving him that money. But then obviously in the playoffs, they can't go out and do what they did before. If we move on to the guy that's hand in hand with that, not a player, but Nick Caley. So this is an organization that did fire one previous offensive coordinator after his second year with CJ Stroud when it just didn't look as good as they wanted it to. How much of that was CJ not being happy with Bobby or et cetera, et cetera? Who the hell knows? Slowick, by the way, I know some of you might not realize this. He's the offensive coordinator for the Dolphins this year. So hopefully Slowick at least gets an opportunity as the Dolphins are in very much a reset mode. I like Bobby Slowick. I know that pisses a lot of people off when I say that. I like Bobby Slowick. I think it was a poor hire by D'Amico to bring in a first-time offensive coordinator with a rookie quarterback and everything else that was going on. Nick Caley was a rookie coordinator last year, but at least he was working with a veteran. But Nick Caley and CJ Stroud working together and getting the operation to look like everything they were talking about during OTAs, the pre-snap operation being crisp, all of that. And then in terms of play calling, this is where it gets dicey with offensive coordinators. There's certain issues I had at times last year with Nick Caley and the play calling, but it's always hard to tell a guy that he should be calling the game differently when the run game itself just simply isn't working. There are times where I think you do have to accept that the run game isn't working and that running on first down when you can't run the ball effectively is just sacrificing downs to the football gods. And you're not really, you can be hardcore in your philosophy, but you got to make accommodations for it. The other thing last year where whether it's play calling or execution of the offense or what have you is they were really limited in attacking all areas of the field. Didn't hit the deep balls as much as you wanted, but part of that was, man, they tried early on and the protection was an issue. Some of the coverages they were seeing made it really difficult, but some of those coverages also make it difficult in the screen game, and teams were very keen to pick up on when the Texans very rarely did throw a screen, and they were amongst the lowest percentage-wise, the lowest frequency screen callers, or Nick Caley called screens very, very rarely and randomly last year. That might change. Some of that also when we start to get, Tank Dell involved if he's out there in the jet sweep game and all of that. Some of the funky things you can add into it. Jalen Noel also. I think about, if you go back to that Chargers game and that touchdown by Jalen Noel, it looked like he was just shot out of a rocket. Or he looked like he was a rocket shot out of a cannon. Thank you. Got to get my large-scale warfare terminology correct. He looked like he was shot out of a cannon. And taking advantage of some of that explosiveness and some of just that menacing speed on the field to open up things for other people to have explosive shots over the top or to do things behind the line of scrimmage, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's potential for that. But really, more than anything, just because it's Nick Caley's core philosophy, is that they have to establish the run. And I know that's a dirty phrase in some circles because people think that's just old meathead football. The run game has come back into the vogue in the NFL. Come into vogue in the NFL partly because defenses have gotten a lot lighter, like physically lighter, as they're geared up to stop the pass. And you got to be able to take advantage of those opportunities. You got to be able to get people to bite on the run. You got to get defensive coordinators to load up the box and create some of those opportunities. And a lot of that just comes down to execution, not just the physical play of the offensive line. But when we go back to those pre-snap penalties, I always look at pre-snap penalties and, a lack of pre-snap motion as a two-person deal. That's both the offensive coordinator and the quarterback. So offensive coordinator is responsible for getting it dialed in and drilled during the week to where you can function on game day and do a lot of funky stuff pre-snap. It's not as simple as just saying, hey, we want pre-snap motion a bunch of places. It's hard to execute that and to do it without making mental errors or without having penalties unless it's taught really well. And then it comes down to the quarterback really being good at directing traffic and being anal about all the details and genuinely coaching all those guys to be sure they're in the right spot. You watch some of these old clips of Tom Brady directing traffic before the snap. It is a whole lot of, Gronk motion and come down inside to the core because I'm anticipating blitz, tweaking the route of a wide receiver, doing all those things. CJ in his second year in this offense, hopefully in working with Nick Caley, is a lot more able and capable of doing that. So would Nick Caley get fired after this year the way Bobby Slowick was fired after last year? I think at this point it's almost a package deal that they're gonna, if it's abysmal, then they're gonna wonder, okay, Do we make it? Do we try a third offensive coordinator with CJ Stroud? Do we bring in a veteran play caller just because he's had experience working with the younger guys or what have you? But it's gonna be a nightmare, and it'll be interesting and lots of content for the offseason. But it's not content that I need. There's lots of things that would be good for my job that I just flat out choose not to do. I don't go off on people with like insulting the hell out of everybody and everything, even though it gets clicks like crazy. I try to reserve that for when I'm genuinely upset and angry. Problem with that is that that means I'm genuinely upset and angry. I can't go through. I'll tell you what, the Matt Schaub season, the pick six season, damn near killed me. I was sitting in a movie theater with my wife on like a Monday or a Tuesday one year during that really ridiculously bad 2013 season. And I started thinking about Matt Schaub and his pick sixes. And I could feel my heart just like racing, and not like in a fun, exciting roller coaster type of way. Like I could feel my blood pressure rising to the point where I had to go out in the lobby and walk around a little bit. I don't need that kind of stress in my life, okay? So if Nick Caley and CJ Stroud care about old Sethers, just get it together this year. Can't have this anymore. But Nick Caley, under a lot of pressure. If we go to the other Nick in the organization, the Nick of note, probably a few Nicks. Nick Chubb's no longer around. I don't know about the other Nicks. Nick Caserio, look, this is another thing we've talked about forever. And look, I think Ariante Ursary was a good pick last year, but at some point, Nick's got to continue to hit on some offensive linemen. If you look at the offensive linemen that they've drafted in the first two rounds since Nick got here, Kenyon Green, Juice Scruggs, Blake Fisher, Ariante Ursary, and now Keelan Rutledge. Of those five guys, one we just don't know yet in Keelan Rutledge, but only one of the other four in Ariante Ursary, I think, is going to be a hit. Like Blake Fisher, we'll see. And I'm open to the possibility that he takes another step forward this year, but so far hasn't really contributed what you'd hope to out of a second round pick. And second rounders are dicey. It's not like you think, oh yeah, we're going to slide them in there and start right away. But those first three, in Kenyon Green, Juice Scruggs, and Blake Fisher, we have yet to see the payoff on those guys. Ariante Ursary, I think we're close, and then Keelan Rutledge, obviously. We hope really works out fantastically well. A lot of pressure on Jake Andrews too, and obviously he's fighting for a spot. If I go back from my own experience when I was going into my fifth year in the NFL, when I was with the Jaguars still 1 year before I came to the Texans, the Jaguars drafted Marcus Stroud, defensive tackle, and basically he was going to be the starter. He's a first round pick. I as a younger guy that hadn't really turned the corner yet in my development. It was really good for me. That pressure, and I was a guy that worked hard and everything, but that pressure kind of just unlocked something in me, and I became a much better player that year, and I started all 16 games and ended up coming to Houston the next year. But I'm always open to guys like Jake Andrews, really with that vice grip type of pressure of, man, you've got a first round pick who's gunning for your job. The Jake Andrews might take a big step forward, but the competition is really good. It's awesome for everybody. And we don't know, at some point, Wyatt Teller or Ed Ingram or somebody, both those guys have been injured in the last year. Wyatt Teller's getting older, so we might see Keelan Rutledge in a couple of spots. But Nick Caserio has done an incredible job drafting on the defensive side of the ball. Sometimes I have to explain to people outside of the market when I catch them saying things like, well, the Texans keep it simple defensively, but it's all just the players there. When you have players like that, but all right, they've got one first rounder in their defensive backfield. Draft doesn't mean everything, but if you're talking about just raw talent and physical ability and all of that, it's not as simple as like, oh, well, they've got 5 first rounders in the secondary and that's why they're so good. No, they've spent at defensive end to get Danielle Hunter in here. They drafted and traded heavily to get Will Anderson, but there are a lot of guys on that defense that are second round or later draft picks. They're, guys like Azeez Al-Shaair, who came in as a free agent, but not a highly regarded free agent and is now a Pro Bowl linebacker. Henry To'oTo'o, a mid-round pick. That's they've done a really good job drafting there and then getting the right guys for D'Amico's system. I don't worry about that. I don't worry about Nick Caserio or the front office and their ability to identify anybody on the field accepted offensive line. And I think some of that's just random luck. If you look at Green, Scruggs, and Fisher, with two of those guys being second round picks, you got a better than 50% hit rate on offensive linemen in the first round. Second round, it gets a lot dicier, but Kenyon Green was obviously the huge whiff there. And some of that's injury related, which you can go back and say, well, he was injured when they drafted him. So it should have been a complete surprise that Kenyon Green had so many issues there. The other guy, defensively, I think there's one guy I would say, Henry To'oTo'o. And it's not like Henry To'oTo'o is a huge issue or they're not happy with him, but they did draft two linebackers in Wade Woodaz and Aiden Fisher. They traded for Marte Mapu. Henry To'oTo'o is going into the final year of his contract, and as of yet, we haven't heard about an extension. And I think he might be right at that spot where maybe they've offered him something, but Henry To'oTo'o feels like he can get himself into being one of the better linebackers in the league. I think he's done an incredible job in the last couple of years of maximizing his athleticism or his athletic ability by leaning out. I think he's gotten a lot smarter in terms of reads and recognition. The question is, okay, is he always going to be limited somewhat in pass coverage? And does it matter on this defense when you have all these other guys around him? I think he's under pressure to show that he should be here long term. And it's not like a make or break pressure situation where the defense can't be good if he doesn't take another step forward, because obviously they're already very, very good. But he's under pressure just in terms of competition on the team, and then proving that the Texans should commit to him long term. That'll be an interesting one to watch, because they've paid, man, if you look at the salary cap moving forward, I used to say, hey, look, don't worry about the Texans cap right now. Look off to 2028 and to 2027. They're just fine. They're up there now. Like, they're spending heavily on the defense. By 2028, they've got the most money committed to defensive players in the league right now. And factor in some of the other things you're going to have to do with CJ Stroud if he plays well, and not to mention Kalen Bullock and Kamari Lassiter and whether they get extensions next year. So guys like Henry To'oTo'o really have to show that, man, I'm worth spending some money on. The other defensive guy, I would say, this isn't a huge deal, but look, he's a high second round pick. A lot of people thought he was going to be a first round pick, Kaden McDonald. And Kaden McDonald is partly under pressure just because he's a draft pick, but I think also partly under pressure because he's put high standards out there for himself. He said he wants to be first team All-Pro in his rookie year. Exceedingly rare defensive rookie of the year. Tough to do when you're a run-stuffing defensive tackle, And Nick Caserio said, hey, remember when he was asked about his upside as a pass rusher? Caserio said, hey, look, we're going to worry about doing what we know we can do right now, which is stopping the run, and we'll build on after that. And it's hard to be all-pro as a run-stuffing defensive tackle, especially when you're rotating in all of the time, especially when you're moving defensive ends down to defensive tackle on pass rush downs at times. So I think, but I do like a young man who puts a lot of pressure on himself. So Kaden McDonald, by virtue of his draft status and the fact that he's putting a lot of pressure on himself, a lot of pressure on Kaden McDonald. I liked what I saw out of him in mini camps or in OTAs. I wasn't at mini camps. But the thing about Kayden McDonald, you have to remember, is that, look, guys like that don't usually make a big splash in non-padded practices. When your calling card is your physicality, there's not a lot you can do without a bunch of tempo violations. Tempo violation is when you go a little too hard in no pads practices and guys end up on the ground and everything. I liked what I saw from him. I love his film from college. Now it's going to be fun to watch him with the pads on and going against veteran offensive linemen and just seeing exactly what he can and cannot do. And then we get into the preseason games too. Hopefully some of these young guys, I know starters are hardly playing anymore at all in the NFL. They've got so many starting caliber defensive tackles, and Kayden McDonald is the rookie. He's going to get some snaps in the preseason. So I'm looking forward to watching with him. If we flip back to the offensive side right quickly, David Montgomery, who has an over-under for rushing yardage on FanDuel of 825.5 right now. It'll be interesting with David Montgomery because I think there's not going to be as much pressure on him as there would be in some places or earlier in his career, because he's not going to be the only back. but I think he does get the Lions' share of the carries early on in the season. I think they probably end up using him a lot more as a receiver than maybe people are expecting. I mean, he's talked about that himself. He's had some good years and good performances as a receiver, and I think that's maybe one of the more underestimated parts of David Montgomery. But more like by and large, I get a little disgruntled when I look and see David Montgomery so far down the list in some of the running back rankings, partly just because so much of it is an offshoot of the fact that he was sharing the field with Jahmyr Gibbs, or at least sharing the workload with Jahmyr Gibbs. And Jahmyr Gibbs took off. He took off like a rocket out of a cannon this year, and his workload diminished over the last couple of years. If you look at the numbers this year where he was running behind a lesser version of the Detroit Lions offensive line, because they were not as good as they had been in previous years, a lot of his numbers are still by and large the same as they've been the last few years in terms of yardage after contact, yards per carry, all of that. So if they can get the offensive line actually functioning properly, I feel good about David Montgomery, and I think he's going to defy a lot of expectations. He also is at that age now where there's only a few guys in the league last year who were league leaders in rushing who were 29 years old or older. Even in the top 30, there were only a few. I think it was Christian McCaffrey, Derrick Henry, and maybe one other guy in the top 30 when it comes to rushing yardage. You guys can fact check me on that. I'm remembering that from when I looked it up like 2 weeks ago. But I do think he still has a lot of it, and not as much tread off the tires because he was sharing carries with Jahmyr Gibbs the last couple of years, which is nice. And the other one that I would say outside of the players, and this is a very hazy pressure point, because the McNair family and Bob and Cal, not Bob McNair, Cal and Hannah McNair are not under pressure in terms of, like, what are you going to do, strip them of their ownership? And I think by and large, I'd be really surprised if this Texans team isn't good this year. However, when you're looking for taxpayer assistance when it comes to either a stadium refurbishment or building a brand new stadium, the best time to do it by far is when you've just won a Super Bowl. Had a really long stretch of success, which the Texans are kind of teetering into, just get up into that category where you're actually going to a Super Bowl or going to a championship game. That's where they are right now. It's a whole lot easier if that's what you want to do. I don't think they were helped out by all these World Cup fans gushing about how NRG/Reliance Stadium is so beautiful, incredible, and new and everything. Like, yeah, compared to some of these decrepit old messes over there in Europe, sure, it's nice. All right, but we've got a higher standard here. We've got a higher standard. Excess, luxury, all of those things that all the Euros were gushing about when they came to visit the United States for the World Cup. But there's some pressure there. I think like the new facility in Bridgeland, somewhere, way off up that way. That's going to be fun, and I'm excited about that. But that's a done deal. That's going to happen. The McNairs, other than that, look, I don't worry about there being a drop-off in season ticket sales or anything. The Texans are very financially healthy. Another couple names that I saw on this list in The Athletic of players under the most pressure from each of these teams. The first one we get to see with the Bills is a fascinating one. Keon Coleman, the wide receiver. So remember, Keon Coleman has had a rough go of it. And like after a lot of excitement when they first drafted him, he's had issues. He's been tardy a few times and been fined for that. He was a healthy scratch in 4 games this year. I mean, the biggest insult to injury was the fact that they drafted him one spot of Ladd McConkey, who's gone on to be pretty damn prolific, Chargers leading receiver last year. It's a big year for Keon Coleman. My funniest story about him was that when Joe Brady became the head coach, he told Keon Coleman something along the lines of, boy, you're so lucky I'm your head coach because I'm going to be good for you. And everybody's looking around like, was he not just the offensive coordinator? Like, what exactly was Sean McDermott doing to undercut whatever plans Joe Brady had for Keon Coleman? I'm not buying that, but we get to see them here in NRG Stadium for the first game of the year and see if Keon Coleman has developed into something above and beyond what he's been the last couple of years. Other guy from the Tennessee Titans, J.C. Latham, the right tackle. I just like that because it makes me think about Daniil and Will rushing on a guy who's under a lot of pressure to keep his job or justify his draft status from a couple of years ago. So there they are. The guys, look, when the Texans are sitting in the position they're in, and so much of the conversation's been dominated by C.J. Stroud Stroud and Nick Caley and everything else. It's hard to find a lot of guys who you feel like they're under immense pressure. I might add Xavier Hutchinson to the mix just because of the numbers now. Depending on how healthy Tank Dell is when he gets back, the fact that like Lewis Bond's a sixth round pick, but not one that is necessarily going to threaten anybody and everybody. But it's getting to be a more crowded receiver room in there, and I look forward to it. This next couple of days, this last week before training camp begins, I usually find myself very, very agitated because there's nothing to get agitated about. I just want something real and substantial to get agitated about. I want to see that somebody's being lazy out there at practice or something. Can you do that for me, Texans players? Just one of you. You'll end up getting cut because of it. Because D'Amico don't allow such things. Okay, all right. I don't know if you noticed that from the motivational posters on the wall. Thanks to FanDuel for sponsoring the Believe in Texans podcast. Please like and subscribe and leave a nice review if you're listening on Spotify, Apple, YouTube. And it helps a lot of other people get filtered into this little community via the algorithm. Until then, everybody have a great one.